sound of voices three. This is the sound of voices three. This is the sound of one voice, one people, one voice, a song for every one of us. This is the sound of one voice.
We begin every year with the 21 flower salute, not 21 guns. We do it to remember those who have perished in wars, whether combatants or civilians, regardless of their nationalities. Their number is in the hundreds of millions. Please join me in thanking the Party Boys for joining us for the second straight year. Paul is an Army veteran who served in Kosovo. He's someone who works for peace every day in one way or another. He's serving as our chapter president of Milwaukee Veterans for Peace for the third time. And Paul will take you through the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. On behalf of the Milwaukee Chapter of Veterans for Peace, I want to welcome all of you and thank you for being here. And I want to offer a grateful thanks to all of the 20-plus co-sponsors that have decided to be a part of this evening. Thanks to the speakers for this evening and the Party Boys for their wonderful music. And to all the members of the chapter who worked hard to make sure tonight, our 12th year observing Armistice Day in Milwaukee, a success. Last year we gathered to observe the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. November 11th, 1918, and the armistice that brought an end to that conflict. This observance in the United States was established with President Wilson's Armistice Day Proclamation of November 11th, 1919. President Wilson's proclamation stated, "A year ago today, our enemies laid down their arms in accordance with an armistice which rendered them impotent to renew hostilities. The war showed us the strength of great nations acting together for high purposes, and the victory of arms foretells the enduring conquest which can be made in peace, when nations act justly, and in furtherance of the common interests of men." In a 1923 radio address, a few months before he died, Wilson shared his bitter disappointment that the United States did not contribute to the developing peace after the war. I would gather that many of us here tonight feel that again, in many ways, this nation stands alone in the world. Through leaving the Paris Accord, by our utter failure in addressing the climate crisis at the federal level, by our immoral and horrid treatment of immigrants, by the continued attacks on unions and working people, the continued vilification of the working poor, and the constant pressure to destroy the social safety net for all of us. But as alarming and hurtful and demoralizing as our current political and social realities are today, here we are, gathered to acknowledge the realities we face together, and to renew our commitments to the work of peace and justice. This is what Armistice Day calls us to remember. President Wilson told us in that 1923 address that the affairs of the world can be set straight only by the firmest and most determined exhibition of the will to lead and make right prevail. And here we are, 100 years later, gathered to that end. Thanks. He is a former longtime chapter president and a longtime member of our chapter, and an ex-National VFP board member. He's been a 50-year patient at the VA who's been involved, deeply involved in the Stop Privatization campaign.
I was a public school teacher for 20 years. I don't need a microphone. Thank you all so much for showing interest in what we are trying to do to stop war as an instrument of government policy. I have the honor to introduce you to my very good friend, Jerry Condon, who is the president of the National Veterans for Peace Board of Directors and a Vietnam-era veteran and war resister who spent 6 years in Sweden and Canada after refusing orders to Vietnam. Jerry has a long history in the Veterans Peace Movement. Since 2004, Jerry has been on the front lines of supporting Iraq and Afghanistan war resistors in Canada, Germany, and elsewhere. Please give Jerry a warm welcome.
We could talk about the original Armistice Day, November 11, 1918, after that horrible first global war where 17 million people died and the world was horrified. We could talk about the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which actually outlawed war. The so-called Great War, the war to end all wars, did not end all wars. It was followed shortly afterwards by the Second World War, where 70 million people, 70 million people around the globe lost their lives in that horrible war. And then not long afterwards, the Korean War. In 1954, the Congress, with the encouragement of some of the mainstream veterans organizations, decided to rename Armistice Day as Veterans Day, which wouldn't have been so bad if it was just about honoring veterans and giving them their due, and maybe giving them the health care that they deserved at the VA. Instead, it was really quickly turned into glorifying war. These Veterans Day parades that are all about glorifying war and making America great again. Veterans for Peace chapters around the country that try to be part of these parades are oftentimes barred from participating because peace is a dirty word. Even in these big patriotic parades, they oftentimes get the loudest applause when they come by with the VFP flags, or as they did yesterday in New York City, chanting "No more wars." The U.S. is still in Afghanistan. It's still in Iraq. It's still in Syria. It's in Somalia. It's in too many other places. We have a resurgence of obvious U.S. intervention in Latin America. This kind of hybrid warfare, which combines threats of direct military intervention, support for violent forces in those countries, propaganda, social media, campaigns, overt and covert intervention of all kinds. A blatant, open attempt to overthrow the government of Venezuela, which just coincidentally is the largest known oil reserves in the world. And sadly, as many of you probably saw the news, Evo Morales was just forced to resign in a right-wing U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia just yesterday. We could talk also about 22 veterans who kill themselves every single day. And not just from the trauma of PTSD from multiple deployments to war, but also from what we've come to know as moral injury, where they find it very hard to live with themselves after what they were forced to participate in. One of our most recent chapters is in Tijuana, Mexico, and it's made up of deported veterans. These are people who, they're like the DACA kids, or they came to this country as young children, sometimes babies, lived their whole lives here, grew up here. They joined the military, volunteered to fight. They've been in these recent wars. They got in a little trouble with the law, usually drug-related, oftentimes having to do with PTSD that they got from their military experience. And then when they got out of jail, instead of going back home to their communities and their families, they're taken to the border and shoved across the border. but they formed quite a strong community, mutual support. We could talk about the twin existential threats facing humankind right now. One obvious one that everybody's talking about now is climate change and climate disaster, climate crisis, to call it what you want. Well, actually, Veterans for Peace is doing some good work bringing this military component of climate change into people's consciousness and into the environmental movement. And of course, then there's the other existential threat, and that's the threat of nuclear war, which actually is a growing threat. Under the Obama administration, there was a commitment made to spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize our nuclear weapons arsenal, which in many cases means creating brand new nuclear weapons that are maybe smaller, more tactical, more usable. And with the aggressive U.S. foreign policy trying to dominate basically every region of the world, it makes the possibility of a nuclear war by calculation, miscalculation, mistake, or otherwise more and more likely. People say that even a limited nuclear exchange between, say, Pakistan and India would cause not a nuclear winter, but a nuclear autumn, like 10 years of very little sunlight, and many millions of people would die. Anyway, so the good news is that people are doing something about it. Well, first of all, the United Nations passed a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons 2 years ago, and that, the U.S. actually organized a boycott of that whole discussion, and they got 40 countries to go along with them and not participate in the debate and not vote. But nonetheless, it does express the will of the majority of the countries of the world. The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons won the Nobel Peace Prize for that. Reducing and eventually eliminating nuclear weapons is an important part of the statement of purpose and the mission statement of Veterans for Peace. But until fairly recently, we hadn't had a very strong manifestation of that part of our program until we found Golden Rule, the Golden Rule Peace Boat. It's an amazing story. In 1958, 4 Quaker peace activists, led by a retired World War II Navy commander, sailed a small 34-foot wooden boat from Los Angeles to Hawaii on their way to the Marshall Islands, where their intention was to interfere with U.S. nuclear testing. So they'd been involved in the anti-nuclear movement, and there was a lot of concern going on about all the radiation that was going around the globe at the time as a result of nuclear testing by the U.S., by the USSR, by the UK, France. Stopped the boat and the crew in Honolulu. But they succeeded, even though they never made it to the Marshall Islands, but they helped build international support for the partial test ban treaty that was signed in 1963 by President Kennedy and the leaders of the UK and the USSR, which banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater, or in space, but allowed it to continue underground. This boat turned up in Humboldt Bay in Northern California in 2010. A derelict wreck of a boat that had actually sunk decided, we're going to restore this thing and rebuild it. And that boat is now a project, a national project of Veterans for Peace. For the last 3 years, it's been sailing up and down the West Coast, raising awareness about the continuing dangers of nuclear war, promoting the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Our intention is to go on from Hawaii to the Marshall Islands, which is the original destination, and be in Japan in August for the 75th anniversary of the U.S. nuclear bombing of the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I just want to thank everybody who's here, especially Veterans for Peace, but I know there's a lot of other groups involved here. So thank you all for your leadership.
We share one thing in common in this group that we share with the Vets for Peace, that we believe that war should be abolished. We're not just against a particular war, we're against the idea of war being part of the human institution. Nelson Mandela said, it's impossible until it happens. And we believe that in our future, and hopefully soon, war will be abolished. And we will not have to have these standing armies preparing for the next war, because there will not be a next war. I think we all share that in common, and thank Veterans for Peace for sharing that message.
If you called me, would I hear you? Do I know what I could do? If you held me like my brother, would I see myself in you?
Proud to be one of the co-sponsors, along with the two primary unions that are caring for our veterans at the VA, the Wisconsin Federation of Nurses and Other Health Professionals, and the American Federation of Governmental Employees. If members of those unions could do a quick stand-up for us. One of our planned speakers for tonight, author Suzanne Gordon, won't be here tonight. We do have another wonderful speaker lined up for you, but I am going to take a moment to read one paragraph from her book, The Battle for Veterans Healthcare. It's a wonderful detailed analysis of the issues at play with the Veterans Healthcare Administration. And a word about my pin. Employees at the VA have been encouraged to be wearing these hearts that say we love our veterans, but the current status with employment conditions at the VA is causing people to feel like maybe this is even a little too much of a statement of employee solidarity. So when putting something on like this makes you feel nervous about your employment conditions, then we know we have some work to do. The stakes in this battle for veterans' health care involve more than veterans. Those affected include veterans' family members, as well as those who work at the VHA, many of whom are veterans themselves. But finally, what is at issue is the future of health care, not just medical treatment, in the United States. If we refuse to care for veterans and view them only as another profit center, how can we possibly learn to care for each other when we are sick and vulnerable? Our speaker is Brett Copeland, the Executive Director of the Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute. His biography states that Brett has seen the best and worst of the federal bureaucracy during his career in Washington, D.C. I would say, come on, Trump's got another year. You might not have seen the worst of it yet. Brett is the son of a Vietnam veteran and a grandson of a World War II veteran. Please join me in helping to welcome Brett Copeland.
I was so proud to help represent VA employees, many of whom are veterans, because of the incredible work that they do at the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Veterans Health Administration that people really do not see because of media reports and the way that Congress treats the VA and the way that presidents, current and past, have spoken about it. The civilian-military divide in our country is great. About 30% of all Americans at any given time are eligible to serve in the armed forces. At the highest, 17% did in World War II. Today, that is at less than 1%. People who are 65 or older, 76% of them know someone who has served, either themselves or their friends or in their family. Folks who are my age in their 30s and younger, only about 30% know someone who has served. So that experience gap is huge. And that definitely translates over into veterans healthcare. Whenever I talk to a non-veteran, I ask them, what do you think the most common chronic condition for veterans is? And they go, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I go, no, that is an incredibly critical thing that we need to address in veterans. But it's tinnitus. It's ringing in the ears. Because almost all service members are around heavy machinery, which results in that tinnitus. That is then connected to a whole host of other issues and chronic conditions. But that's just a small example of the knowledge gap that people have about veterans. What they see is sold to them in the media and by lawmakers. There was one study that was done in New York that came up with 7 measures of readiness to treat veterans. And they are accepting new patients, accommodating patients with disabilities, you hope that these days that's pretty common, screens for common veterans conditions, uses clinical practice guidelines, is prepared to treat veteran conditions, screens patients for military service, familiar with military culture, which is critical in being able to communicate with veterans to really understand their needs. Only 2.3% of providers in that study met all 7 of those criteria. Only 2.3%. So you've got this group of people who are very well educated, even in the private sector. You know, they have to go through a lot of training to become a physician or a care provider. And that gap is that big. And then you get to the media. It's going to be really difficult for them to understand veterans and veterans' needs and veterans' health care and veterans' healthcare system and the legislation that controls that system. So you've got doctors and the media who have a hard time understanding veterans. And then, my God, you get to Congress. What are they supposed to do? If doctors and the media can't figure out, we're going to rely on Congress to create clinical care guidelines. Congress is essentially the board for the largest integrated healthcare system in the United States. That is terrifying. The Veterans Healthcare Policy Institute was really created by a group of veterans, Suzanne, a journalist, and healthcare providers to tell veteran stories, the reasons for their chronic conditions and the effective treatments of their chronic conditions, and analyze policy to see how, when they go into a healthcare facility, how care plays out in the real world as a result of policy, and being able to explain that to the media and decision makers who are responsible for crafting that policy. Rather than fixing the problems, many political groups are taking those problems and creating wedge issues out of them to divide and conquer the electorate to further their own agenda. And Wisconsin is ground zero for that happening. Tons of ads were run over the last several election cycles by a group called the Concerned Veterans of America, which it is unclear as to whether they have any members or not. But they're using the VA and quality and delivery of care at the VA to divide the electorate and essentially further the privatization of the Veterans Health Administration. And that group was founded by the Koch brothers. They don't understand what the VHA is or the VA is. At the VA, physicians there are focused on the clinical needs of patients. You have a whole team of doctors for one patient. Dietitians, people who help with housing, people who can help as social workers. It's something that, again, most Americans cannot even fathom. And it's all coordinated through the VA. But the people who wrote the rules in the Mission Act, which is the latest and largest privatization scheme to come out of the wait time scandal at the VA, weren't concerned with clinical care. What's happening in a lot of VA facilities is these veterans are becoming automatically eligible to join the community care network, which is outside the VA care, just because of these very administrative rules. In my mind, what should determine the kind of health care that a veteran gets is the right treatment from a qualified provider at the right time. Evidence-based clinical care. Instead, this automatic outsourcing was really written by a private sector that doesn't have to follow them themselves. To be counted as a qualified provider to see veterans, all that you have to do is sit through a 60-minute video presentation. Once. Just once. The division leader of an insurance company, Anthem, was in the room when these rules were being written. She said that if the Veterans Health Administration introduces extra standards, quality standards, that they could not guarantee anyone was going to be available to care for veterans. Another exec said that performance data, in my mind, performance data is outcomes, wellness, is the veteran getting better, But instead of those things, performance data should be measured in just invoices. Profits, not patients. It's the American healthcare system, baby. The VA budget last year was $200 billion. That's the largest it had ever been. A good portion of that is going to non-VA providers down the community care network. So if the community care network of private providers goes over its budget, so that money's going to have to come from somewhere. And at VHPI, we're worried that it's going to come from the successful evidence-based programs at the Veterans Health Administration. And right now, there's 49,000 vacancies. Is that right? At the Veterans Health Administration. That's the number of provider vacancies at the VA. We have aging facilities, understaffed programs. Is there, in a lot of places, any other answer than automatically outsource veterans? It is going to be hard to continue to provide care to veterans at the Veterans Health Administration if something does not change. We recently did an interview with former VA Secretary David Shulkin, who was famously fired by tweet by President Trump. But he said in this interview, unless you have a vision of what veterans care should be, and you look at underperforming facilities as they are, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to closure. Right now, there is a group or a commission that was set up under the Mission Act, has a board appointed by the White House, and they're going across the country and looking at VAs to improve, expand, or close. For a lot of these understaffed, older facilities, that answer is probably going to be pretty easy to make. This is from the chapter called Thank You for Your Service, ? In June 2017, the White House held a signing ceremony for the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act, attended by Secretary of Veterans Affairs David Shulkin. The act, which he supported, weakened due process rights within the Department of Veterans Affairs, leading to the dismissal of hundreds of housekeepers, nursing assistants, or cafeteria workers, rather than, as intended, any top administrators guilty of wrongdoing. Less than a year later, in March 2018, Shulkin learned of his own firing via a presidential tweet. As the New York Times noted, the Trump administration's appointees behind this decision had ties to Koch brothers and the group they called Concerned Veterans of America. After signing the Mission Act, President Trump issued a signing statement asserting that he alone had the right to determine the composition of the Asset and Infrastructure Realignment Commission created by the Act. The legislation specifies that its members include several VSO representatives. Trump said he would be happy to replace them with healthcare industry executives who would benefit from VA privatization. Of greater concern, the White House opposed a bipartisan effort to fund the new legislation, arguing for cuts in other VA or federal spending instead. Congressman Tim Walz, who voted against the act, reported a stark picture of a VA forced to cannibalize itself in order to pay for private care. The defense of veterans' care is, thus, turning out to be a series of skirmishes on multiple fronts in a long political war. The momentum at the moment definitely favors those who do not view the VA as a national treasure. Under a different Congress and a better president, there will be new opportunities to keep health, healing, and the giving of hope in the hands of those who truly care about veterans. Rather than fixing the VA as it stands now, we are breaking it so that it mirrors the worst parts of the for-profit healthcare industry. But this is our chance. This is our chance to stop measuring outcomes in military budgets, and casualty numbers, and corporate earning statements. If we lose the VHA, we lose a system that is focused on the patient's total state of being, meaning that we recognize and prioritize peace after war, healing the wounds of inside and out, and ultimately see the humanity in each other. So I urge you to take a look at our congressional guide, grab Suzanne's book, and really start talking about veterans and their experience in the way that you know. We're asking questions. But thank you so much. I'm so sorry Suzanne could not come. Please pick up her book. It's a work of art. So.
I